Hey, brothers. I'm going to do this one take. Here's my notes, which aren't very prolific. But regarding that conversation last night where we were laughing so hard in Tommy's kitchen, Michael, you were in rare form, but I never got a chance to speak, so I'm going to speak now in this little video. So something happened. I'll use as an analogy. Last night, Higgins and myself and Michael were having a conversation in the one room, and John was describing a drug that his company's developing to kill cancer cells. And the way he said, explained to Michael and I, he says, we have a payload that's attached by a linkage to an antibody that's directed towards an upregulated protein that's present on the cell membranes more abundantly on cancer cells than in non-cancerous cells. And that when the antibody binds, it brings along that toxic payload attached to the linkage. It's phagocytized by the cancer cell, and then through enzymes that only exist in the cytoplasm of the cell, that linkage is cleaved, allowing that drug to be released into the cytoplasm of the cell and kill the cancer cell. So I don't know if you followed that, and I'm kind of hoping that you actually didn't. But I know when Higgins explained it to Michael and I, there was not one part of it that we didn't understand completely. And the reason is because we have this extensive background. We spent a lot of time trying to understand the basics of microbiology, cell biology, chemistry, pharmacology. So it's something that is built one brick at a time. In order to have that statement, some patient goes into an office with cancer, you stick a needle in their arm and open up the IV, this clear liquid goes in and the cancer cells die. So if I said, well, this is how it works, this is what happens to kill the cancer cells, it shouldn't make any sense to you. But it makes sense only to Michael and to Higgins and myself, because we spent a lot of time like literally starting with the periodic table of the elements, understanding what elements are, understanding what atoms are, understanding how they react, understanding what electronegativity is, understanding what different functional groups are in organic molecules, what an acid is, what an alpha amino acid is, what an amide bond is, what a protein is, how a protein makes an antibody. And to make this drug, there's thousands of people that have expertise in producing the antibodies and producing the medicinal chemists that can link this drug up to the antibody so that it works intracellularly. So you shouldn't, if you hear a statement like that, it shouldn't make sense to you, but you may accept it because they stick the needle in your arm and it cures the cancer, right? And the Bible sort of works the same way. So when Greg made the statement, you can't really believe that a virgin gave birth. It doesn't happen in nature. It actually does in something called aparthogenesis, but that's a whole different discussion, not relevant to this topic. But you believe it happens? And the answer, I would say, I believe it happens in the context of, I'll use the term salvation history. Forgive me if that seems a little bit spooky, but in terms of this history, and the only way to understand it is to literally spend hours or years looking at the Bible with your butt in a chair and the book in your hand. And though you've said you read the Bible, and Mike's reading the Bible right now, and a lot of these things you come across don't make any sense, you really need somebody that's skilled, particularly if it's the Hebrew Bible, the first 5 books especially, to explain what you're reading. And I'll give you the perfect example is just the beginning of the book. Genesis starts off with the sentence, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Right? Okay, you move right past that. But if you have, these are where my notes come in because I have to kind of elaborate. And this is just a skeleton. I mean, there's probably encyclopedias written on just the significance of, it's an exaggeration, treatises written on just this first sentence because it literally has changed the world. First of all, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Created means there's a creator. If there's a creator, things that are made typically have meaning. If you make a tool shelf or bookshelf Michael made with his decks off of his backyard to put his stereo equipment on, that has meaning, it has a purpose. Same thing with Greg when he puts up the pegboard in his garage and hangs up all those tools excessively neatly. There's a reason for it. There's a meaning behind it. So what that first sentence, one thing you infer from the first sentence, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. If there's a creator, things are created because there's a meaning and a purpose to them. Now, an atheist will say, well, you just made up God. Yeah. And therefore, since you made it up, God doesn't exist, which every atheist will do. Yeah, at the same time, they'll speak out of the other side of their mouth saying, well, there's things have meaning, life has meaning, and I will posit back to them, well, you're making up meaning. If I make up God, and therefore God doesn't exist, and you make up meaning, therefore meaning doesn't exist, they will argue vehemently against you, saying that things have meaning. The majority of atheists will do that. There's a creator. The inference is there's meaning to what's been created. Created, the Hebrew word for created is bara, B-A-R-A, would be the English alliteration. Hebrew, that verb is only used when God creates something. When God creates something, it's different than when you create something. When Greg made the Okefenokee Trail, or Mike made those bookshelves out of his deck boards, he made them, right? As Milton Friedman said, you make a pencil, you make the pencil, but you didn't create the gutta percha rubber. You didn't create the metal. You didn't create the paint, the dyes, the pigments, the wood, the graphite that's been mined. Greg didn't make the tractor that cut the Okefenokee Trail. He didn't make the trees. He didn't make the earth. That stuff was created by God, is what the Bible posits. It's a different verb. It's used only in terms of when God creates something de novo. The other thing that's unique about about the Hebrew language, is that their verbs have gender. There's male and female. There's no neuter Hebrew verbs, and the inference is if it's bara is a male verb, the object to which it refers is therefore considered to be male. But I'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, which means there was a beginning. You take cosmologists, and thanks to the work of Albert Einstein, even things such as time are believed to have a beginning. So this is very different from the static design of it's always just existed. The earth always just existed. Cosmology tells us that's not the case. God created the heavens and the earth in the beginning. There's one creator. It's not polytheistic like there's hundreds or thousands of Hindu gods or all the different gods of the Romans. There's one God, as what that first sentence says. There's no birth story. All the other gods, the Roman gods, somebody comes down and rapes somebody. That person has a baby. That baby's now a god. All the other religions have these, they're called theogonies, have these stories about how their god or gods, not gods because they're all polytheistic, how their gods came into beginning. The Bible doesn't have that. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It means God exists outside of nature. God created nature. It also desexualizes. All the other religions, they had breasts, 4 sets of breasts, and 8 sets of breasts, and multiple penises, and they're male or female, and that doesn't exist in the Hebrew religion. That doesn't exist in the monotheism of Judaism. I hear Greg thinking, well, who made God? And that kind of logic is, well, who made God? Who's God's dad? Who's God's dad's dad? Who's God's dad's dad, etc., ad infinitum. And the beautiful part about this, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It doesn't propose. It doesn't explore. It doesn't give an explanation. It simply states that God exists. I'll ramble on a little bit more just about belief versus disbelief, and then I'll get into something else that Michael brought up. One thing that I heard Greg talk about last night was saying how you prayed and prayed, but you want dad to get better, you want mom to get better, and we see all this stuff that we perceive as unjust suffering. You see a good person like Mama Bear, a good person like the Papa Bear. Why did dad have to die such a horrible, just miserable death? And it's easy to say, and as a believer, the unjust suffering, challenges the conception of a good God, right? So every believer admits that, yeah, there's unjust suffering. I can't explain it. I don't propose to explain it, but I don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So as a believer, my mission is to, I have to wrestle with why is there unjust suffering in the world? But the atheist has to account for everything else. Everything else that they described, they have to, I have an explanation for it. They have to explain everything else. And I know that's a bit of a rambling thing. It's hard to cram this all in just a short video. Unrehearsed, so I'm just flying off the cuff. Mike mentioned he was looking in one of the Old Testament books within the Torah where God commands the Israelites to wipe out the Midianites, the man, woman, child, and all their farm animals, the entire thing. Hey, babe. So, why? And so the Midianites were trying to convince the Israelites to abandon their belief in the one true God. And they were trying to convince them to convert to idolatry, worship idols. So God said, yeah, wipe those people out, right? That's the time. It's not over and over again. It's like the incident. And the biblical scholars will say, well, yeah, but that's not actually what happened. Because later on, when you go other books that come beyond the first 5 books of the Torah, the Midianites are still around. Midianites come down into Canaan. They chase the Israelites up into the hill lands, and they steal their cattle and their crops for a period of 7 years. So, yeah, to kill these people. Well, why is that said? It's basically he's being said, look, these people are trying to get you to really go down this really hideous path. You have to understand what existed back then when they were sacrificing their children on altars to these deities that they created. Stop rambling on about that. But if you don't think the stuff was bad before then, just look at Aztecs, cutting out human hearts while the victims were still alive on an altar, ripping their heart out, then taking a bite and chopping their head off and throwing their head down the steps of the pyramids. I mean, it's insane. This is the stuff that God came along and said, like, this is bullshit. There's one God. I'm your God. And every one of these things that are written in the Old Testament have explanations. So I randomly opened up this my copy of Dennis Prager's book on Deuteronomy. I just opened up to chapter 22 to see if I could have any scribbled notes of my own. And so this is an example of something that's in the Bible. It doesn't make any sense. If you see your fellow's ox or sheep gone astray, don't ignore it. You must take it back to your fellow. Like, what? If a sheep or his donkey goes astray, bring it back to him? Well, the Hebrew, I have to look down at this to explain this. Hebrew word translated as don't ignore it is actually literally means do not make yourself disappear. So if you're in the car, you're in a parking garage and you bump into somebody else's car and suddenly your bumper puts a big scratch on their door and you make yourself disappear, right? As opposed to leaving the note saying, dude, I'm sorry about this. Here's my insurance information. Here's my cell phone number. Call me. The Bible, your Bible, says don't do that. If your fellow does not live near you or you do not know who he is, you shall bring it home. It shall remain with you until your fellow claims it. Then you give it back. You shall do the same with his ass, do the same with his garment, do the same with anything that your fellow loses, and you find you must not remain indifferent. So this is an instruction from God saying, basically, to go do unto others you what others do unto you. It's not finders keepers. I'm in the parking lot of Walmart. Holy smokes, this person left the thing in the bottom of the cart. They didn't realize it. I'm going to put it in the back of my trunk. Or do you bring it in because you know they're going to come back and claim it? So the Hebrew God is saying, do this thing properly. And he's given examples contemporaneous at the time, using examples that existed at the time this stuff was written. If you see your fellow's ass or ox fall on the road, don't ignore it. You must help him raise it. Kind of makes sense. But he's saying, the Hebrew scholars say, it's not enough just to not be bad. Yeah. You got to strive to be good. Don't just walk by. See him there. Help him. Help him get it up. How about this one? A woman must not put on a man's apparel. nor shall a man wear woman's clothing, for whoever does these things is abhorrent to the Lord your God. Like, what? I'm not going to go through the entire thing. Actually, I could. It's probably the coolest one, but it describes how the Torah always is making distinctions between light and darkness. In the beginning, land and water, good, evil, God, man, God, nature, man, and animal, life and death, parent, child, holy, profane, male, female. These giant lists of these oppositions. And these distinctions are part of if you're Christian or you're Jewish, it's part of God's design. I'm not going to go into all the detail. God created them male and female. He created them. It says in Genesis, the Torah prohibits the deliberate blurring of lines between male and female. And then here's kind of the money shot for me. Many scholars believe this prohibition is related to ancient transvestite religious rituals. So it's got to say, dude, like, don't put on women's clothing. Ladies, don't put on the men's clothing. Because the ancient pagan transvestite religious rituals, it most likely is. Like, that's why that statement is made. But it's easy if you want to make fun of it and take it out of context and don't understand the historical context. It's easy to make fun of it. But if you have scholars guide you through it, it can make sense. And this book can be brutal if you don't have a guide. And I say this book, I don't mean Dennis Prager's book, I mean the book of Deuteronomy. In this book, it's not enough to just read it. Like, if you read that and it says, don't put on women's clothing, what's that in there for? Within the context of saying, don't participate in these pagan religious rituals. Do you understand the difference? So anyhow, Greg, when you ask me, how can I accept these things? And it's impossible to do this, and it would take multiple hours. But within the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and the rest of it continues with what we call the Old Testament, there's dozens of things that point directly to the time and birth of Christ. And the things that Jesus said and the things that Jesus did only make sense. The truth and the meaning of them is only revealed by understanding what Scripture is. So the same way that the concept of phagocytosis of a toxic drug bound by a linkage that can only be cleaved by intracellular enzymes to an antibody directed at an upregulated protein that's abnormally expressed on a cancer cell membrane, that shouldn't mean shit to you. I promise it's perfectly clear to me and Brother Michael and John Higgins, because we have the background. And the same thing is true. You can just say, I don't understand any of this crap in the New Testament. Because not you, Greg, in particular, but without an understanding of the depth of it, it's difficult to appreciate. And one other thing is, you say it's a fairy tale, like Harry Potter. Well, the thing that's interesting about the Harry Potter fairy tale is that one person made it up at one point in time, sat down, probably smoked a lot of pot, took some mushrooms, wrote this crazy story with these themes that she stole from J.R. Tolkien. But the Bible's written over thousands of years by 60 books, I don't know how many books there are, dozens of books, dozens of authors that link together over time. When you sit down and you write a story, you do it. This is dozens of people without an understanding where it was going to lead to, and then it comes to fruition in the New Testament. New Testament only makes sense if you understand the Old Testament. So just like there can be cancer of your body, and there's a way to treat these things. Hopefully they're going to be really great tools in the future from medicine. There can be cancer in your soul. It doesn't mean that the treatment isn't real because you don't understand where it came from. It doesn't mean the New Testament's not real because you don't understand where it came from. Love you guys.